Most of the time when we read the Bible casually, if you do so, maybe at one time or another you've tried, I'm going to try to read this thing from cover to cover, or I'm going to try some reading program where I bop back and forth between the Testaments, or however you have tried to read the Bible in the past, if you have. It often doesn't occur to us from book to book when things were written and how much time has elapsed over the course of the whole Bible. From stem to stern, we're talking thousands of years. But for those of us reading now, it just kind of is all old, right? And it's all old, so we all kind of stick it in the same spot. Whatever era you grew up in school, so I was born in 67, so there's little bits of laughter from different people, that's fine. 67. So whichever, it's all relative, right? And so, pick your year you were born, and the things that were happening when you were small, you don't have any real personal recollection of. So even though theoretically I was alive during the Vietnam War, Vietnam to me was still in the history book, the same as World War II, the same as the Spanish-American War, the same as everything back. So it all kind of gets lumped in the same bin, right? And regardless of what era, if you were from my parents' generation, my folks were born in 42, you were theoretically born, during World War II, but a lot of that is fuzzier for you than it would have been for your parents, et cetera, et cetera. So, because the early church chose texts from the prophets to be read during Advent, and they definitely work thematically, it doesn't occur to us that depending on which prophet you're talking about, you're talking anywhere from 500 to 700 years before Jesus' birth. It means the prophets were as far removed from Jesus as Christopher Columbus, or the Italian Renaissance, or the current configuration Christopher Wren's building of St. Paul's Cathedral in London are from us. Just to give you a little bit of a time frame. And so even though we're talking 500 to 700 years earlier, somehow these prophets still speak into the moment when Jesus was born. The prophets, again, depending on which one you're referencing, they kind of are all over the map in terms of years, are active either before, during, or immediately after the period of the exile in Babylon, which we date at 587 BC, before Jesus. Habakkuk, whom we heard from this morning, was prophesying prior to the exile, anticipating both the terror of what was to come and God's ultimate judgment of the Babylonians. The themes of exile run throughout all 3 chapters of his book. It's a really short book. If you want to read the whole thing, you could probably knock it out just like that. In fact, what Jeannie read for us this morning probably comprised about a quarter of the book already. The themes of exile run throughout all 3 chapters of the book, and it's astounding how those themes, even hundreds of years later, still resonate in Jesus' day, and then thousands of years later, still resonate in our own day. While most often when you hear me reference the exile, I'll be talking in terms of the Babylonian exile. Exile is a recurring theme, though, throughout ancient Israel's history. Sometimes it's a literal exile, right, where the people are hauled off into another land. Sometimes it's more of an internal exile, where the people are made to feel like strangers in their own land as another power occupies them. In Jesus' day, the exile was imposed by Rome, who occupied Palestine. But Roman domination was just the latest in a long line of imperial domination. Preceded to some extent by the Greeks before them, definitely the Persians before them, the Babylonians and the Assyrians that we know, the kingdoms of the south and the north. But it goes all the way back to that first foundational exile, right in the book of Exodus, as the Hebrew children were held captive in Egypt. There you go. I just had to make sure you're still with me. Yeah. There you go. Egypt. So how in the midst of this history, I mean, yes, there were there were times of relative peace and prosperity, but there are these continuous cycles of domination and empire and economic oppression and exile. How in the midst of that history, how in the midst of the impending terror that was to come for Habakkuk, does Habakkuk pray the prayer that he prays, especially the climactic ending of the prayer? Though the fig tree does not blossom, and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the olive fails, and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold, and there is no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength, who makes my feet like the feet of a deer, and makes me to tread upon the heights. Though everything else fails, says Habakkuk, still I will praise, still will I hope. That floors me. That's astounding faith. I mean, if we're honest, our faith is often built on far more shifting ground, shall we say. Right? We say things like, everything will be okay. It'll all turn out all right in the end. But what about when everything is not okay? And things do not turn out all right in the end? Then we need a faith like Habakkuk's. Though all else should fail, still I will praise my unfailing God, still will I hope in my unfailing God. There are other examples of this kind of faith in the scripture. The one that really speaks to me is also from chapter 3 of a book in the prophets, Daniel chapter 3. It's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which if you hadn't realized that, by the way, is what Abednego is named after, is Abednego from that story. So, you learned your new thing for the day. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been taken in the Babylonian exile to Babylon, found themselves in service to the king whose name was Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was kind of a trip, to say the least, and at one point he built for himself this massive golden statue that he commanded all the people in the land to, at certain times of the day when the musical instrument sounded, they were all to stop and they were to turn and bow down to the idol and worship Nebuchadnezzar as though he were a god. And of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, being good Jewish boys, were not about to do that. And the punishment for not bowing down to the golden idol was to be thrown into a blazing hot furnace. And when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were snitched on that they were not bowing, Nebuchadnezzar confronted them and said they had to do this. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, but even if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. If our God chooses to deliver us, woohoo! But even if God doesn't, even if we should blaze in the furnace, we have faith. God is with us, and we are doing the right thing." Job had that same faith. We often talk about the patience of Job. That's baloney. Job wasn't patient. He constantly was haranguing God. God, I know I didn't do anything to deserve this. Answer me. Where are you? At least acknowledge me. Over and over. And he was not patient, and he had every right to not be patient. But what Job had was faith. Faith to keep haranguing God. Faith to believe that God was good and that this could not possibly have been part of God's plan. God, where are you? God, acknowledge me. And while most people reading Job think that the happy ending where Job gets all his stuff back is the moral of the story, that's also That's a crap ending. I'm sorry. Somehow or another, the real ending didn't screen test well, and they tacked on a happy ending. Because the real ending is when God speaks to Job out of the whirlwind. And Job takes a sigh and a breath and looks toward heaven and says, "There you are, God. You have acknowledged me. I know you are with me. Okay." Even in the midst of all his suffering, knowing that God was there was enough. The message of Easter Sunday, even beyond the mystery and miracle of resurrection, is that God is with us, alive and well, that love never ends, and that love is stronger than death. The miracle of Christmas, more than being able to travel back in time if we could and do a DNA test and tell Joseph Maury Povich style, "You are not the father." More than that, the miracle of Christmas is that God is with us. That's going to be the refrain, by the way, just so you get it. Jesus' life reveals to us the fullness of who God is and who we were created to be as God's children. God is with us. We long to be delivered. We long to be saved. We long to be brought back from exile. We long to be saved from our alienation and our loneliness and to be fully restored. But even if these things do not happen, God is with us. Still we will praise. Still we will hope. Many of you who are on Facebook may have seen this cartoon, and you may have felt a little bit of a twinge or may have felt your eye twitch when you read it, because it, at least for me, it kind of hit a sore spot, but it made me think. It was a preacher gathered in front of folks at a funeral, and he said, "We are gathered here today because none of your prayers worked." And that made me think. Now, if the power of prayer is getting what we want, of bending God's will to our own, then the cartoonist is right. But if the power of prayer is communion with God and creating a community with one another in order to navigate the slings and arrows that life throws at us, then our prayers avail. They do not fail. Our prayers knit us together with God and with one another in love, so that, like love itself, we can bear all things, believe all things, hope all things, endure all things. And that is the power of prayer, that God is with us. There are times when it is difficult, yea, nearly impossible to see that God is with us. We turn to the advice of Mr. Rogers' mother, right? Who told a young Fred when he was wondering, where is God in the midst of this? She said to him, look for the helpers. And that is a glorious comfort, and there are so many times when we can see God's kingdom breaking in and through other people who are striving to do the right thing and to help and to hope and to bring the gifts of themselves and their very being. But when we can't see the signs of God's kingdom, even when looking for the helpers is failing us, because God is with us, we can be the sign of God's kingdom. When you can't see the sign of God's kingdom, be the sign of God's kingdom. We can cultivate relationships that allow for the inbreaking of God's kingdom. What do I mean by that? Just in these last couple of weeks, and John can tell the same stories, and so many of you can tell the same stories as well. right? I've been with folks who would never have been the type to admit that they are suffering with depression, become vulnerable and say, I am overwhelmed by all that's going on, and I feel depressed. I've been in the midst of people who, in the midst of their struggle, whose natural tendency would be just to try to skate on the surface of things and not address the depths of their grief, just by asking a few simple questions to dig a little deeper. I've seen them break through the walls of that separation that people put up, that defensiveness, and admit to what they're feeling and build bridges of love and hope and find healing. Just last week, I had a hug I'll never forget. The hug of a man who told me this is the first time I've been able to let go and sob since the shooting at Oxford High School. And never has my heart been broken and so full at the same time. That is the inbreaking of God's kingdom that we cultivate when we enter in deeply into relationship with each other, and when we realize that God is with us and gives us the strength to do just that, and to be God's representatives to others, that when they are without faith, without hope, that they can see in us that God is with them. And even when our efforts seem paltry, and the fruits of our labor are hard to come by, even when we feel overwhelmed and underpowered, hungry and helpless, despairing and desolate, still we can rejoice. It's not always like Kermit the Frog, yay! Sometimes it's a quiet rejoice. Sometimes it's a rejoicing that people see in our tears rather than our smiles. Still we rejoice, still we hope, still we praise, still we love and live, for God is with us. God who is our strength, who is our song, God who is our creator and the cord that binds us together as one human family. God who can set us to dance on the heights, steady of heart, sure of foot. The God of our salvation, the God of every nation. At the end of his life, John Wesley, laying on his deathbed, with friends gathered around him, did not reminisce about all the amazing experiences of his past, did not dream about or envision all the things that were to come when he closed his eyes and slipped into whatever heaven looks like. No, he looked at everybody gathered around him, looked them in the eye, and said nothing about the past or the future, but all about the present. He said, the best of all is God is with us. The best of all is God is with us. Joy to the world, for the Lord is come, and God is with us. Amen.